This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is James Gardner, aka Coach James. He's a survivor of near-death experiences, lives with a brain injury and physical disability, and he's turned his experience into helping others. He works as a life coach to empower people to become the best version of themselves. We had a fabulous conversation today. We talked about resiliency as boundaries, how trauma puts someone into survival mode, not necessarily the ability to thrive, and we even touched on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Hi, James. I'm excited to be talking with you today.
Hi, yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And before we get into the meat of the matter, I want to ask you, if you could have a superpower, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a tough opening question, but I like it. What would my superpower be? Oh, let me have a think. I would probably say maybe flying, but another really good superpower would be able to help people and like have X-ray vision and see healing stuff and see like where things are going wrong, so I can help them more. So that would be a cool superpower to see
nice.
where people's blockages are and how I can best help them.
Yeah. And I like that you're using your superpower for good and not evil.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, James, who are you and what do you do? And how is it that we are talking today about resiliency?
So I'm James Gardner, or Coach James, recently qualified as a certified professional life coach.
Nice.
My niche or my area of interest is trauma and PTSD and resilience, because when I was 5, so that was in 1986, I was involved in a car accident and sustained massive brain injury. And I was in a coma for 3 months, and they didn't think I would survive.
Wow.
And then when I did, they struggled to like get me off of life support machine and get me to breathe on my own. But when I did, I was like paralyzed, major brain damage. And obviously at 5 years old, that's a major trauma to be going through.
Yes, absolutely.
Since then, I've been like on a lifelong journey, putting myself back together again, learning to walk after they said, oh, he's probably not going to walk. And if he does, he won't have a good quality of life and all those type of things. And then so I've made it my lifelong mission to make myself the best version I can possibly be. And then I got into personal development after doing lots of physical therapy, going to the gym a lot, and then still feeling a bit broken, a bit like, is this all there is? Like, and then the light bulb moment was when I started to address my emotional aspects and my mental health. Someone said to me, have I addressed my trauma? And I was like, well, my trauma happened like 30 years ago. It's like, right. What do you mean? Of course, that's like just sorted itself out and it's gone on its merry way into the universe. And of course, but No, I read some books and I did lots of research because I was at the time a journalist, so I was heavily into reading and researching. So I
Mhm.
researched this trauma, and it was like an epiphany, all these light bulb moments. And I was like, oh, that sounds just like me. And oh, yes, my digestion is sluggish, and this, yes, and my circulation is poor. And oh, yeah. So it was like all these aha moments. And then I dug into trauma and like did a lot of research. And then my world started slowly to fall back together once I like looked at all these aspects of trauma and understood what was going on and
Yeah.
how to understand it.
Must have felt so incredible. I remember similar moments for myself reading things and realizing, oh, that's what this is.
Mm.
That's why this is happening. So that must have felt incredible, like you were almost finding yourself finally.
Yeah, really strange because I didn't used to have an appetite.
Mm.
And I was like, well, that's a bit strange. And then through understanding trauma, it's like you can lose your appetite and your feeling of hunger and zest for life because when you're in trauma, that's not important to your body. It's
Right.
in survival mode. It's not in thriving mode.
Right.
So all the things like that aren't important to survival go bye-bye. And I was like, well, that makes sense.
Well, and your story of such significant trauma that you faced and the very real concerns the doctors and I'm sure your family had about your
Mm,
future. It just reiterates, I think, that we focus on the physical because that is important.
hmm Yeah.
Absolutely. But sometimes to the detriment of the mental health, we don't necessarily think about that once the physical is back up and running. And it sounds
No.
like that's what you experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. For years and years, it was all about James learning to walk, James picking himself up. Like I remember being in a hospital bed and people were saying, well, try and sit yourself up. And I would try with all my might to sit up on my own. That's how bad it was. I was like, my nan said I was like Pinocchio, like a rag doll, like when
Oh,
I first
wow.
came back from the coma. And like, so I like literally had to learn to hold myself up and
Wow.
then so start from nothing. Always been about the physical, yeah.
Right. Although the physical certainly sounds like a tremendous amount of work that you have done on your physical health to get yourself to
Mm,
where you are. And now you started addressing the mental health side of it, which is fabulous. Well, and you have used your experience and now you are helping others.
mm.
What do you think about the word resilience?
Ooh, you've got so many great questions. To me, resilience. I was reading a book or listening to a podcast the other day, and they talked about robustness, and I
Mhm.
was like, "Oh, that's kind of like resilience. Is like how robust you are, how well you can spring back,
Mhm.
hold yourself." So to me, resilience is about knowing who you are and where you are. And
Mhm.
then so you can't get knocked about too easily and you're resilient and like almost like being, I suppose, almost like being tough, but
Mhm.
being resilient, being able to bounce back from the brink and that sort of thing. So resilience to me, it's not a thing. It's like a process.
Mhm.
That saying when they tough times make tough people. It's that
Mhm.
kind of thing. It's like you get more resilient by going through hard times and learning to bounce back and learning to grow through things. So for me, to be resilient is to be strong enough to know who you are, to be able to stand up and survive hard times and be
Yes.
resilient through the odds.
Oh, thank you. And you mentioned like that it's a process. And
Mm,
that's something I've been reading recently. I've been seeing some people say it isn't necessarily trait or a character trait, but that it's a set of skills that
mm.
we access when we need them. Does that ring true to you?
Interesting set of skills. I've never thought it in that way, but I guess having the skill set or the mindset to be resilient to I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around boundaries. So I think
Oh,
resilience is about knowing where your boundaries are, knowing when things are overspilling. I wrote in my book about coloring outside the lines. If you know where your lines are, then you don't color outside of them.
right.
So I think like resilience is about knowing where the lines are, where it gets too much for you. So I
Yeah.
think that is a skill. So yeah, that's a good point. I like that.
Well, and I really like thinking about boundaries and resilience
Mm.
as connected in the way that you describe. So, given your life experience, what do you think people misunderstand about trauma the most?
I remember writing one of my first articles on trauma and PTSD, and I wrote, trauma doesn't just happen on the battlefield.
Hmm.
When I first got introduced to trauma and PTSD and that side of things, I thought, well, it's normally like for people who are in the army and people who go to war and shoot guns and everything. I've not done any of that. So I'm like, how can I be affected by trauma? And then you understand, like I write about these two aspects of trauma. You have big T trauma, like car crash or something significant, life changing like that. And then you have the small T trauma, rage or someone cutting you off or things not working out or just life going wrong. How you
Yeah.
respond to it can be traumatic, but that's a small T trauma
Hmm.
as opposed to the big T trauma. So I think people don't understand about the small T trauma. They just
Hmm.
understand about like the life and death situations, the battlefield trauma.
Yes.
I think if people can understand and know about the trauma response that we hold within our bodies, that is like just the vending machine not dispensing your candy bar can be traumatic.
Yes, absolutely. When you need that candy bar, that
Yeah,
is a trauma. I appreciate you talking about your thoughts kind of early on. Well, trauma is something that happens on the battlefield, and that's not me. I
mm,
had the very same thoughts after my experience of this isn't that, so that it can't be trauma.
exactly.
And I didn't realize that whether it's a big T or small T trauma, that just regular people, non-military people, we can experience these things just throughout our lives because things
Absolutely.
happen.
Mm,
So I feel like we had some very similar thoughts about our
yeah,
own
definitely.
trauma.
And I like what you said there about the battlefield. I mean, depending on your perception, life can be a bit of a battlefield. So,
Absolutely. And there are people who will say, and I think I tend to agree with them, that it's going to be really difficult to get out of this life without some form of trauma, whether it's something significant like what you experienced or something not quite that much, but or
mm,
whether it's ongoing trauma, like living in
yeah.
a community where there's a lot of violence, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think none of us really get out of here without experiencing some kind of trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And trauma is like, I don't know if you're aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when at the base level you have security. And then for me, my trauma mostly came into play when my sense of comfort and security was taken away.
Yes.
That can also come into effect, like losing a loved one
Mhm.
or something that can be traumatic as well.
Right. Well, I never thought about it through the hierarchy of needs, like how it is actually impacting maybe that basic level of what you
Yeah,
need, which is
exactly.
security.
Yeah, very much so. And I heard another saying the other day, in lots of trauma groups on Facebook and things, was as trauma survivors, we know how to survive, but we're not very good at learning how to live.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I can see that.
Yes, we're good at surviving, and when the going gets tough, we get strong and we know what to do. But when everything's calm, it's like, well, what's going on? It's like we're not good at the life skills because we've just got the good survival skills
Yes,
and being resilient. Yeah.
I so feel that in my bones, James, when you said that.
Mm,
I can see me in that statement.
mm.
So I have said, I'm sure that you have heard something similar, which is I have often said that trauma is the gift that keeps on giving.
It sure is.
We can laugh about it, but I couldn't always laugh about that.
No, it is that process again. It's like we have to go through it, and then once we've processed it, then we can have a little giggle about it
Right.
or reflect on that. But until, like, it's that thing about Steve Jobs said, we can't connect the dots going forward, only looking back.
Yes.
So that's the same thing with trauma. It's like you can't like appreciate it looking forward. You have to reflect on that.
Yes.
And then making sense of the world. That's also what I help people do with life coaching, is to make sense of the world, to help them build the foundations that they need to thrive. So
Yes. And I think, as you know, experiencing trauma can really chip away at those foundations, and it can be hard to know how to make your way in the world. You know, we've talked about resilience as personal issue, whether it's a skill you have or it's a character trait. It's something that we each possess and we have certain levels of it. I don't always like the word resiliency because of the way I feel like it gets used sometimes. And I think a lot about the role of society, the system, the organizations that we're part of, whether it's a workplace or some other community that we're part of. I think about the roles that they play in supporting resiliency or not supporting resiliency. What do you think about that? What do you think is the role of our organizations or society in supporting and helping people recover from trauma?
I like that looking at the bigger picture type of thing. I think like big topic at the moment is that I'm getting involved with is neurodiversity and equality. So I think it falls under that umbrella. If it's about providing people with that stability, with that stable structure to thrive, no matter to what, to be adaptive. And like, I know resiliency is about being strong and about bouncing back and about all those survival type things, but it's also about adapting, having to adapt to circumstances as well. So I think society, places of that need to be adaptable. I know there's a lot of places that aren't adaptable. It's like, this is the way we do it. And if you don't like it, then that's tough. But in this day and age, you can't do that. I mean, you need to update with the times. It's like, it's all about equality. And we've seen a lot of that throughout the last few years happen, that people are equal. We're all on an equal, no matter what our life story, circumstances are. We're all entitled to whatever we want within the right realms. But yeah, it's about that, having the accessibility and the adaptability for people. So I think it's organizations and I might say governments and that type of thing, to be adaptable and understand that everyone's not the same and treat people equal. Because I'm big into like equal rights and being a disabled person myself and living with disabilities. That's something that I'm involved with and I like understand. So it's about like having the accessible wheelchair spaces and all those type of things. There are arguments about having we call them guide dogs, but I know in the States you call them eye-seeing dogs, and like whether they're allowed into certain spaces.
Right.
And I think partially sighted people or blind people, they're really strong and resilient to put up with what they've got to put up with.
Right.
It's still about equal rights and allowing them to have access to the support they need.
Right. And no matter how resilient you are personally, if a building isn't going to let you in with your guide dog who is enabling someone to live their fullest life, then doesn't matter how resilient that person is if you keep bumping up against these kind of roadblocks. You know, especially given your work with equal rights and disability activism, what do you think is the biggest roadblock for organizations to be supportive and create equal environments and accessibility and all of these things that we're talking about. What's the problem? Why aren't people doing it?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think on a basic level, it's understanding. It's like people are quite closed off to what they don't know. And they're all like, this is how we do it. And if you don't fit into our model of our business structure or something, then you can't really be a part of us. But I think it's like people need maybe some educating about it, or it might need better PR.
Yes.
And I know when I traveled, I've done a lot of traveling in Asia and China and Thailand in particular. And then I noticed there were signs, and I found it a bit offensive towards disabled people, but because it's just a lack of understanding.
Right.
If your world is not, I wouldn't say perfect, but if you live in an ideal world and you don't see people with disabilities, or they're not on your radar, then you're going to be closed off to that. And then like, if you meet someone who doesn't fit your stereotype, you're going to go, well, you don't fit into my cookie cutter. So maybe they need to get some flexibility and adapt a little bit to the thing.
I like the way you're thinking about it. Education and I guess exposure to different kinds of people. It's hard to empathize with other people's experiences if you've never had a similar experience, I guess.
Very much so, yeah. And this is why I enjoy the kind of coaching that I do with people, because I've had 3 near-death experiences, the car crash being one of them. So I can really empathize with people. I've been on life support and had brain surgery and everything. So I can really empathize and put myself in their shoes, because I've been to most places that a lot of other people haven't. So that makes me easily relatable to other people who are going through similar things. And I know people who've suffered with trauma, they're so thankful that there are people like us that understand it and have been there and have done the work and the research and everything. Because I think if you just go to see someone and they haven't experienced it, they just imagine what it was like, and then they don't really know, and they're just doing lip service to a certain degree.
And I do think for some people, certain kind of situations are just hard to imagine, or they're so frightening to imagine. Trying to imagine what you must have experienced being in a coma and all of the work that you had to do to recover physically, if I think too much about that, it's very upsetting to imagine what must that have felt like for you. So I think sometimes too, it can be hard for people because it's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like places they don't want to go in their head. Yeah. Whereas I'm like, I didn't really have a choice. It was 6 years ago, 27th of April, that I had my 12-hour brain surgery to remove a tumor from my head. Half my brain was knocked aside by this massive tumor. But yeah, I remember the morning my parents took me to the hospital, I had to sign a piece of paper. I understand the consequences of this surgery, that I could have stroke or memory loss or I could die. And it's like, well, how many people sign a piece of paper that says that at 7:00 on a Wednesday morning? Not many.
Right. Oh my goodness. You have had some amazing experiences, and it's so wonderful that you're using those experiences to help others. Now you've written a book, haven't you?
I have, yeah. And I'm working on another one at the moment. So
well, tell us about the books.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So yeah, my book on trauma, it's called How to Heal from Trauma and PTSD, Your Ultimate Guide to Becoming the Person You Want to Be. And you can find that on Amazon.
Okay.
Someone said, have you addressed your trauma? And I was like, well, no. And then I started reading all these books. I'll just backtrack a little bit. I was working as a journalist, as I mentioned, and my editor had asked me to interview Jack Canfield.
Oh, yeah.
Who writes the Chicken Soup for the Soul books, and he's a big life coach in America. And so I interviewed Jack, but it was almost Jack was giving me life coaching. And like from that, what got me to realize the trauma aspect and take 100% responsibility of my life, which I never knew that was a thing. I never heard that before because it's always been about my caregivers and me learning to walk and then me learning to do this and do that. It's never been about what I want. It's always been about what I've been told I need to do. So that was a real big eye opener. It's like, I can actually choose. Yeah. I have a say in the matter.
That must have been such an amazing revelation.
Yeah. And so then through Jack's work, I read a lot of his books, and then I got into the good work of Dr. Bruce Lipton. He's a friend of mine now. Through the biology of belief work, did my reading, and then I learned so much about trauma and PTSD, and I was like, well, why has no one ever told me about this trauma thing before? Mm-hmm. It's been 27 years, and no one's really said, oh, have you looked at your mental health or your emotional well-being? I've seen thousands of doctors and physios and all that, and it's always been about my pelvis isn't level or my scoliosis or something. But if they just said, well, have you learned to meditate? Have you learned to connect with your heart center? Have you learned how to breathe or just sit still? Those are all new concepts to me. And then so I thought I have to write this out in a book for other people.
Nice.
Because if no one's told me, like, other people need to know this stuff. Jack talked to me about success is like a combination lock. Once you know the combination and all the numbers in the right order, then it will all unlock. And that's like understanding trauma is about learning the combination for the lock of like how to turn your lights back on. Because when you go through trauma, it's like the lights go out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so glad that you wrote the book, and thank you as a trauma survivor for taking your experience in your research and putting it out there for us. Now, can you share with us what you're working on for your next book, or is that a secret?
No, it's not a secret, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you for letting me share the information to help as many people as possible. So my new book that I'm working on at the moment, it's more about what I've learned through doing the life coaching and other people's experiences. And
oh, wow.
This is like the third draft of the next book I've done, but I was going to call it Manual to Your Best Life, or like a life instruction book that you wish you had when you were born. They don't give you the instruction books.
Right.
Right. Start off the book. You'd go to a car dealership and you save up for this new car and you work long hours and then you finally get your dream car and you finally sit there and you smell the leather and you touch the dashboard and then you open the dashboard and there's this book of how to take care of your car.
Yes.
When to MOT it, what fuel to put in it, and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You hit this world, you don't have a logbook or a guidebook or a manual or anything.
Mm-mm.
And I wanted to set out and write something along those lines.
Oh, nice.
This is how to get the best out of yourself.
Wow. Oh, that's great. That's great. And I think there are many of us who wish we had that manual. So looking forward to that being published. So, James, we're getting close to the end of our time. And I wanted to ask, what's one question that you wish I had asked you, and how would you have answered it?
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a really tough question.
That's okay. You might not have one. It's
no, I like it. I think it would be, I'm feeling into my heart, like, what would that be? What would be most helpful for you or for someone in trauma to help them navigate life? Mm-hmm. What's the missing aspect? What do you feel is not available? Something along those lines.
Okay. And what would your answer be to that question?
Oh, again, another great question, even though I came up with it.
I know if you're like me, James, you've done so much research on this topic and you've thought about it in so many different ways.
Yeah.
That there's probably too many answers for you to choose from.
Yeah, no, true. But I would probably say, going back to what we talked about earlier, oh, this is really good. I like this. It was about people understanding and people being aware and having been educated in the aspects of trauma and physical disabilities and what it's like for other people.
Mm-hmm.
When I did my counseling training and life coaching, it's like put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think a lot of people can do that properly.
Mm-hmm.
They do it superficially, but to properly see where I'm coming from. People see me and they assume I met someone today and he said, "Oh, have you got cerebral palsy?" And I was like, "No, I've got a brain injury, but it represents a cerebral palsy." I think people just see things and automatically assume it. They don't fully understand and then see where I'm coming from. And that's a little bit frustrating sometimes.
Yeah.
And I wish people, not just for myself, but if people understood things a little bit better instead of getting annoyed with me because I got in their way or something.
Yeah.
People weren't so stuck in their heads so much and they could empathize a little bit. I'll tell you a quick story. I go to the gym every other day because it helps with my mental health as well as my physical side of things. But when people don't put the weights back or they move equipment and they leave barbells lying around, and then it becomes like an obstacle course for me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why don't people think about other people, not just people that have a mobility problem, but just why don't they have the decency to put things back properly or leave things where they're meant to be? That little thing would help me so much because I get really angry and wound up, just like, why are people so thoughtless? So,
James, that is a question for the ages. Why are people so thoughtless?
yeah, absolutely.
And when you figure out the answer to that, you have found the key to it all.
Oh yeah, I'm going to find that key.
This has been such a great conversation, James. My last question for you before we wrap up is, what would you tell your 18-year-old self about resiliency?
Probably the same thing I say to a lot of my coaching clients, to be fair, not to take yourself too seriously and don't be so hard on yourself. Mm-hmm. So I know that's two things, but I'd maybe say don't be so hard on yourself because that is taking yourself seriously. So cut yourself some slack.
Yeah, that's a good one. So again, James, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. How can our listeners reach you?
Oh, thanks. So, so I'm known as Coach James. So I'm Coach James on Instagram and then www.coachjames.uk. So it's at Coach James UK on Instagram and then coachjames.uk for my website and then Coach James on Facebook and other things. So on Instagram is where I mainly hang out as Coach James. So that's at Coach James UK as well.
Great. I'll put the links for those in the show notes so people can more easily reach you. And we'll put a link to your book as well. If people might want. Oh,
fantastic. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for helping people get the word out about resiliency and trauma and educate the masses more.
Yes.
To make it easier for the trauma people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. I love this work and I love talking to people like yourself to learn what other people are thinking about resiliency. And, I just want to say thank you to our listeners. I hope you had a fabulous time in this episode as I did, and we will talk again soon. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinski.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinski, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.